I can see some of you are alumni. Raise your hand if you're an alumni of Col-Hi. Did any of you go to Bartlesville High School?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a few, and we have some that went to Col-Hi. So you all know the building is the same, but the name has changed. Now, I had the experience of stumping Debbie Neese one day when she was working with us. I know, it is impossible, but I did it. I was doing some sort of research, I can't remember what now, but I found this article that talked about the municipal building and how Frank Phillips had donated money to have the municipal building built. And I couldn't figure out where it was. And Debbie didn't know where it was either. And that was the miracle in itself that I stumped her. And so the first place I looked was over at Hillcrest because we knew it was on that side of town. But then I figured out it was part of the high school. And I'm like, okay, well I feel really proud of myself now. I stumped Debbie. But then she's like, you need to contact Granger. And I'm like, okay, who's Granger? And then, of course, Granger Meador is the Chief Communications Officer and Technology Officer at the school district. And he's also a local historian, yes, and he has an excellent website connected to the Bartlesville Public School site. If any of you are interested in the history of the schools here in town, his website is fabulous, and it's under the directory of history, right, Granger?
Yeah, just Google.
Yeah, you'll find it if you Google it.
What's the name of it?
It's under Bartlesville Public Schools. And if you type in like history of Bartlesville High School, you'll find it.
Thank you.
And it connects to all the schools that have ever been in town as well as the ones that are here now. So it's a very thorough website and I recommend you all go to look at it. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce Granger and we will let him take the stage.
Thank you, everyone. I'm a transplant as well. I am not a native Bartian, although I came to Bartlesville all through my life because my father was born in Dewey. And so my grandfather came in a covered wagon from Missouri in 1920, and they couldn't afford a car. And so they came by wagon to Dewey to work at Dewey, Portland, and he was a machinist there. And later he worked for city service, which you probably have heard of because that was important in Bartlesville. And so we would come through Bartlesville to go up to Independence, Kansas to visit my grandparents. And my dad worked for City Service Gas, and so we would always stop in Bartlesville and visit some old City Service employees, including Frank Rice, who gave tours as a Boy Scout of the courthouse when it was brand new in 1913. So all those connections got me interested in the history of Bartlesville because I visited a lot, but I didn't know that much about it as a kid. I knew it as the Pizza Hut, and you drove by the high school, which was actually sooner, and then you went to Frank Rice's house and learned stuff, and then you went on. And so when I came to Bartlesville, I've told this story before, but when I came to Bartlesville to interview to teach physics, the principal at the time said, well, you know where the high school is? And I said, yes, I know where it is. It's over there on Baylor. It's a nice looking building. And he said, oh no, that's not the high school anymore. And I went, oh. He said, we're in the older high school that's now the real high school. I went, I was starting to get confused at that point. And he told me where to turn, and he said, you can't miss it. It's the white building on your right. And so I went, okay. And so I came to Bartlesville like I always did, and then I took the turn he said, and I went out. It basically seemed to go out in the middle of nowhere, and I thought, well, I've left town. I've clearly messed this interview up because I'm not even in town anymore. And then I went through this floodplain in these woods, and then I went past, and I saw this large white building, and said, well, that's probably a mental institution. And then I looked again and went, no, that's it. That's it. Because you gotta, I mean, if you don't know Bartlesville and weren't raised here, you might not realize how odd the Col-Hi building is. It's very strange in that it's a Streamline Moderne, very large Streamline Moderne building, and you just don't see that in high school, especially in Oklahoma. And so it's an unusual building. And so when I went in there and I interviewed and I saw the terrible physics lab they had at the time, I was like, wow. And they even took me in the old auditorium and I went, wow. Because it, at that time, was in its last legs. And then they took me downtown and took me to the SC. And basically, I wasn't that impressed in that I thought the buildings were beautiful and old, but old and needed help. But I took the job because I knew Bartlesville's reputation. I'd recruited National Merit Scholars at OU, and so Bartlesville was just cranking them out. And so I knew the quality of education here, and I said, well, I'll give it a shot, because it's a chance to teach physics all day, and boy, I'm glad I did. And of course, I learned a lot about the high school, living there and working there for years. I taught physics for 28 years at the high school, and we added on to it multiple times, and we built new labs, and we built new things, and you'll see that here. But it's a story of change, and that's what the interesting thing about the high school's history is that it's a story of change, and then long periods of stability, and then massive change again. And so the nice thing about Bartlesville is because it has been fairly stable, it's been about 35,000 people my entire time here in 36 years, that stability means that we don't just keep tearing stuff down and building new. We reuse a lot of what we have, if it's any good. Central's a great example. It's over a century old, part of it, and you'll see a slide of what it looked like then. But I think that's a great strength of Bartlesville, is that we take the old stuff and we make it new again and make it work. And it gives kids a chance to learn in an environment that is both old and new at the same time. And so we're going to look at some of the history of it. They asked me to, fill you in. We'll see if this thing will wake up. There is no HDMI output signal, though this is what we call a technological problem. But this is what they came to solve. And so I will try to solve that problem. So let's see. Let's go in here and let's try and mirror this display again and see if it feels happy. Now I'm going to throw this little switch and then throw it back on. And did it go to sleep?
Yeah, I think it went to sleep.
Now
I
he's
think the
thinking.
TV went to sleep.
It's like, well, maybe.
There we go.
There we go. All right, let's go back to DHS or Col-Hi if you prefer. There it is. Zip on through. You can't really talk about the high school without understanding where it comes from. And so before Col-Hi, the very first time we graduated high schoolers in Bartlesville was on statehood. It was in 1907. And it was at Garfield. Does anyone remember Garfield? You saw it in person. Because I never got to see it in person.
there.
Yeah, because I never got to the side of town. Where was Garfield?
Community center.
Community center, yeah. So Garfield was there. Now, it probably didn't look like that when you saw it, because it probably didn't still have the bell tower on the front.
Right.
No.
But they'd removed that and changed it over the years and added more classrooms onto the sides. But that was where the first graduates came from, back in 1907. And they did finally have to build a school because the town was booming, and so they built a dedicated high school. And it's gone, of course, as well, but it was a pretty imposing looking structure, pretty ornate. And it's where the Ritz apartments are now, so about 10th and Dewey. And so it was a beautiful building, but it was too small. It's one of those things that the old pictures kind of fool you. It looks massive, but when you actually look at it, it's like, oh, it didn't have very many rooms at all. It was not built for the capacity they would need. So when they built the high school, they opened it in 1911, and it was only used for 15 years before it was utterly overwhelmed with kids. And that's because Bartlesville was just booming with the oil boom. And so by the time they finally got out of there and went over to Central, it was just jam-packed. They had 250 student capacity when they designed that building, and it had 373 before they got out of there. And that's kind of a theme you'll see. Central also got really jam-packed before they got out of there. Col-Hi got really jam-packed before they opened sooner, and so on. So you'll see that pattern happening. One thing you have to understand about why they did what they did was the booms, and I wouldn't call them all busts. There's only really been one bust. But booms and idle periods in population growth in Bartlesville. And that's the early boom that went up into about the 20s. And then we had a flat period, and then of course that's through the Great Depression and into the war. And then when people came back from the war, they decided to have a lot of babies. We've all heard that. And so there's the baby boom. And then there was another period where it was just more gentle growth, and then there was a little boomlet, I would call it, in the 70s, where the town grew a little bit, and then we had the big bust. And the big bust was during that one decade where Bartlesville population actually went down slightly. And then we've had kind of slow, steady growth ever since then. We're actually up a little bit. We're almost 40,000 now, whereas for years it was about 35. Now, what does that mean for schools? It doesn't really exactly match because kids age through. So you can have a boom, and that boom for a school may last 12 years, right, as the kids are advancing through. So even though the baby bust has arrived, the bust hasn't hit the schools yet. And that's what Bartlesville ran into with Sooner High. And so you can see that there was pretty steady growth up through 1930, and then this chaos through the Depression years and the war. That's when College-Hi, of course, was opened, right? It was in 1940, January 1940. And then they had the baby boom, and that boom lasted all the way until the very year that they opened sooner. And that's when the bust was hitting. And there you can see this immense fall off in enrollment in the school district. And of course, that's why they didn't keep Sooner that long, right? There was already talk after it opened to start shutting it down, and eventually in 1982 they did combine the schools in Granger and around. And we've been fairly steady ever since, about 6,000, 6,500 kids. We've had a little bit of growth last few years. Supposedly it's kids coming in from California. We don't know, we just take them all. So that's Central, and that's, you might visualize Central looking like that, but that's Central before the addition. Because Central was the first junior high in Oklahoma, and that's one of its distinctions, is no one had come up with a junior high until that time. And that's just the older part. So this is the western part of Central, and that's the part that goes back to 1917. And then they had a big bond issue in the 20s because of that overcrowded high school to add on. And that's why if you actually visit Central, you'll see that it's marked as a senior high school in the entablatures above the doors on the Delaware side. Okay, so on where the main entrance is now. So if you look over at Central, you'll see that it still says senior high school in the stonework up there. And in fact, if you look at the school board minutes through the era of when College-Hi was opened and Central was still functioning in different ways, they talk about Central as a high school still. It gets confusing. When they say high school, you have to say, well, are they talking about Central or are they talking about College-Hi? And that's one reason the College-Hi moniker started evolving, was because that's where the junior college classes had moved to, was College-Hi. They weren't being given at Central anymore. But Central had junior college classes actually longer than College-Hi did, which is one of those odd little facts of life, is that the junior college classes actually began in about 1927 at Central, and they lasted until College-Hi opened in 1940. And College-Hi, the junior college was only there until 1950, so it only was 10 years. So it's one of those oddities that College-Hi had less college than Central did. But it's one of those flukes of history. And they actually reached 1,700 kids at Central, which is as many kids as we have now in the entire high school by the time they got the College-Hi open. So you can imagine it was probably pretty packed, especially those little rooms at Central. And of course, school bonds are hard in Bartlesville. That's one thing I learned when I came here, that school bonds were not an automatic yes. Because I had come from Putnam City schools in Oklahoma City, where at that time it was just easy, just like, just vote yes, vote yes, vote yes. Then I came to Bartlesville and I was like, maybe, convince me. Is it worth it? And it was like, wow, they actually, demand proof. And so I looked back at all of the 30 bond issues we've had since 1959, because I was curious about how many had failed and succeeded, and 1 out of 3 failed at least partially or fully. Of asking the people to vote and not getting that 60% supermajority. So it's not easy to get a bond issue in Bartlesville. We always have to work at it and earn it. And so these are some of the old programs I found when I was going through stuff of promoting different bond issues. And we've had several that I've been involved with over the years. Some of them have passed, some of them have not. So the question is how they fund this high school. And if you're not aware of it, of course, a big chunk of money came from the federal government. It came from the Public Works Administration, PWA. Not to be confused with the WPA, which is the Works Progress Administration, which did a different part. And so they had a lot of free, there is no such thing as free money, but they had free money to help them build a high school, and that helped convince the town to do it. But they did have to come up with some more money on their own, and they're tight. Bartlesville's always been tight on money. And so they were willing to do a bond issue, and that would pay for a little bit over 1/4 of the cost of the high school for the bond issue they passed. And then they agreed to increase their building fund levy, which is a standard levy to help build schools. Then they had some cash left over from their existing building fund levy that was lower, and they still didn't have enough to build the thing when they actually got into it, so Frank Phillips stepped in, and that's where the story comes in, because he built the manual training building. And he built it for the Phillips 66ers in his mind, but also to help out the schools and help make Bartlesville a better place for his employees to live. But he was the one who made that last chunk of the pie happen. And that's why I kind of was the one who told them, let's call that the Phillips Field House when we opened the new field house. Because I said, Frank paid for that. Why don't we acknowledge it? They never could acknowledge it at the time because it was against regulations. Because they'd accepted all this federal money, you were not allowed to have a person's name associated with the building. And so they couldn't name it the Frank Phillips Building. They had to call it the Manual Training Building. And it was funded by the Frank Phillips Foundation.
Where is that building?
That is the old gym.
Okay.
So, and you'll see pictures of it, but that's the old gym and all the little rooms around it that were shops. That was
Yeah.
funded by Frank.
Okay.
And so that's how they got the money. The question is, next, where did you do it? And the answer was, you find some land, and it's land you can't afford, so you actually get a donation. And so they went to John Kane and C.E. Burlingame, who are both very successful, and they said, we would like to get some land. And they said, well, okay, it's appraised at $25,000. Well, I'm sorry, the federal government will only pay $10,000 for a piece of land. And again, they're using that federal money. And so basically, Kane and Burlingame donated $15,000, which was real money at that time, in the cost of giving up that land and selling it at a cheap price. And that's Louise Kane at the groundbreaking there, and John Kane is behind her. He's the guy kind of tilting his hat. And so it's on their land that that property was developed, and that was due to PWA limitations. And so this is one thing I had fun doing, was going and pulling the original blueprints for Col-Hi, because we have them. And they're not easy to find, but I know where they're at. And so this is Country Club Road, which later became Hillcrest. Shawnee would run right around here, but it's not there. This is what was going to become 16th Street, okay, if you can imagine that. The tennis courts would be about there. And this was the old Wolverine gasoline plant. So there were actually old foundations and stuff all through here. There were no houses yet. And an old tank and different things for this old gasoline plant. And then out in the floodplain, there was one little house that would be beyond Shawnee now. And then there were a couple of sheds, and that was it, because this flooded. Right, this flooded regularly. And this was the high ground. You can see these are contour lines. This was the high ground when they built it, where they said, okay, we can stay out of the floodplain there. And they succeeded. We've had to deal with that ever since, though. Every time we expand the campus, we have to worry about flooding.
Sure.
And when they added the stadium, it got flooded. As you probably know, if you were here in '86, you'll see that. Who designed it? John Duncan Forsythe. Very good architect. He did the Marlin Mansion. How many of you have been to the Marlin Mansion? You should go if you haven't, because it's fabulous. It's just a fabulous.
Should we call it a castle?
Yeah, it's an amazing building. And so he designed the Marlin Mansion. He designed many other structures. But of course, it's the Depression, right, when Col-Hi is coming along. And so he's just looking for jobs. And so he designed the Will Rogers Memorial in Claremore during the Depression. And that's another fabulous building.
Yes.
And then he designed Daniel Webster High School. He was willing to take on a school commission because he's looking for work. And so he designed Daniel Webster, and because he designed Daniel Webster, if you've ever been to Webster, it is the sister of Col-Hi. It doesn't look like it from the outside, as we'll see, but if you go inside, you're suddenly like, oh, where am I? Because it looks like Col-Hi. And what really happened was he designed Webster first with a higher budget, and then Bartlesville came to him and said, help. And so he designed Col-Hi to be out of brick and to look like Daniel Webster and use the same finish on the inside. And it was going to be kind of a mirror image of Daniel Webster, just cheaper, until Dewey Portland intervened. And the Dewey Portland cement employees made a petition, and 273 of them signed it and said, please build the building on concrete, help our plant survive, because they were struggling. And the school board in Bartlesville agreed and said, yeah, let's do that. And so he had to change his mind. He had designed it, redesigned it in concrete. The answer, though, is he'd already done that. He built his own house in Tulsa in Streamline Moderne concrete. And so if you look at Col-Hi, it really looks like an overgrown version of John Duncan Forsythe's house on the outside, and on the inside it looks like Daniel Webster High School.
Is his house still?
Yeah, it still exists, and you'll see a picture of it right here.
Okay.
There it is.
Wow.
And so that is his house in Tulsa, and if you look at that, you'll say, ooh, yeah, because it is just like Bartlesville High School. It's Streamline Moderne, which means it's got a lot of horizontal forms, curving forms, it's made out of concrete. It's very similar.
And do you know that address, Tulsa?
I can give it to you. Yeah, I can give it to you.
Yeah, it'd
Yeah.
be interesting.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it'd be fun to go see it. And there's glass block things, just like in Col-Hi. If you were there, you know that there was glass block used in the stairwells, especially, and a few places inside. And that's very much the thing of the day. And so it's one of the largest Streamline Moderne buildings in existence is Bartlesville High School. People argue about whether it is the largest. It doesn't matter to me. It's huge. And it is all in that style, including with its additions. And so that's why Col-Hi came out the way it did. Now this is a shot from the early 50s, or probably really about 1948. And so you can still see that it's the original building here, separated from the Frank Phillips building, which is the manual training building. And you can see those same forms, like here you see on the green room, which it used to be off the auditorium, has that rounded form, kind of reminds you of different things from that era. And it's a beautiful building, as long as you maintain it.
Yeah.
And so there's another shot of it. The original paint was soft coral, whatever that means. This is like any paint, you know, it's like, what does that color mean? But it did have, does anyone remember when it had red on the spandrels? It was red between the windows. It was not blue.
Red was Frank Lloyd Wright's.
Yes, yeah, very much a Frank Lloyd Wright
And the
color.
soft coral may be similar to the color that's on the community center
Yeah,
now.
and so you can see, if you look at this shot, that it still has those red spandrels. It was originally red between the windows on those metal spandrels there. And that's one of the few shots I found that show that color, because a lot is black and white. Now this is to show you the idea of sister schools. That top picture is a stairwell at Daniel Webster High School, and the bottom one is a stairwell at Col-Hi. You can see that you wouldn't even know it's a difference except for the paint job around it. Although if you look very closely, if you're a true nerd, then you will notice that he spent more money here making these corners fancier than they did here. And there's little touches all through the building like that, you'll find. Like in the auditorium, they had lights in the end of their seats at Daniel Webster, and Col-Hi was the same seat without the light, because that cost money. You know, it's just interesting how they just did these little things to stay under the budget, because remember, the budget was tight. Here's the auditoriums. The top one is Daniel Webster, the bottom is Col-Hi. And this is the auditorium that they showed me in 1989 for some reason. I think they were trying to scare me off, because they opened it up and I smelled the mildew, because there was mildew. And I went, whoa. And then I saw these immense green curtains. I mean, just huge green curtains. And I thought, are those original? And the answer is no. I now know those are not the original curtains, because the original curtains were not green. They were orange. Does anyone remember orange curtains there? I doubt you're that old. But yeah, and I found that out only because I found the article where they bragged about their new building, and they talk about all the colors. And I went, oh. So then I said, well, then when did those drapes all change? Because drapes are expensive. I'll tell you right now, we hold off on drapes, on things like that. And the answer is probably 1968. It's probably 68 renovation, because they did a big renovation in 68 because of Sooner High. And that's probably when this changed colors. And that's what it looked like when I came in. The reason it was mildewy, by the way, is that a steam pipe was leaking underneath.
Oh.
And that was why it was mildewing. They eventually fixed that.
Why would they pick green for Col-Hi when Sooner was?
Well,
Yeah.
they had green in the auditorium already. So I think they were just matching the existing auditorium,
okay.
because it had this gray-green racing
yeah.
stripe tile all around the bottom. And so I think they were just echoing that
Okay.
in their choices. But yeah, it is interesting that, you know, they didn't go Kelly green. We know that. Yeah.
I went over there maybe 10 years ago and I noticed the seats had shrunk with age.
Yes, that happens. It does. It's amazing. I've noticed that on airplanes as well, but I think those might actually have shrunk.
Yeah, I think we did.
So this is an old picture from when it was brand new of the auditorium, and it never looked that good again, I'll tell you why. And that's when the balcony was still in full use, the projector booth, everything else, everything's pristine. And if you really pay attention, you'll notice light is streaming in from this side, because these windows are still being used. And of course that wouldn't happen after the mid-50s, because they built the annex and completely blocked all that off. And so when I went in there, you open the windows, you would just see blocks blocking it up. Yeah.
What year was Col-Hi built? I mean,
39 is when it
39.
was officially completed, but they didn't actually move the classes over until January of 1940 from Central. They walked their stuff down the block to it. Which is like these lots of free labor, and the kids can just carry it with them.
didn't the WPA build that, or did they?
The WPA helped fund it.
They helped
Yeah,
fund
the PWA and the WPA. The WPA did the outside, PWA on the inside, as you'll see. Here's a picture that I like of the old stage in use with the old drum majors and stuff like that. And you can see those racing stripe styles. To me, that's just so vintage looking at what it was like back in the day. And then here's one of, I think this is about 1970. And this is one of the graduation ceremonies where they were honoring seniors. You can see they filled that sucker up with just the kids, just the senior class. And then they've got some orchestral people in the front. The band is there, and then a few people up in the balcony. You can see now the drapes are closed on that one side because, of course, all that's blocked off. And I would be the one who would eventually make use of that to make handicapped access, as you'll see. I was teaching physics, and I was up in the annex, which is that add-on, and it had no, only stairways. That's the only way we could get to it. And so we had kids who were in a wheelchair and needed to take physics, and I was scared to death because that meant they would move you to a room that had no physics equipment at all, so that you could teach that child, because that child deserves an education. And so I was like, we've got to fix this. There's no handicapped access in this building. This is crazy. And so I was the one who went in the auditorium and pulled open those old drapes and said, we could bust out that window and then build a ramp on top of the balcony, and we would have access from the 2nd floor to the 5th without an elevator, without almost any expense at all. And so that's what we did, was we actually jackhammered out this bit of concrete on this side and then built a ramp that allowed us, and we called it, I'm a physics teacher, so I called it the quantum tunnel. Because it took you from the 2nd floor to what was called the 5th floor, because of the weird numbering, and you never went through the floors in between. You just did a quantum leap.
How did they get to the balcony with their wheelchairs?
They didn't, yeah. Although they could have gone up through the elevator.
Oh, there was an elevator?
Yeah, so there's an elevator, and the elevator, actually, there's a story on that. The elevator was added in '74, and they had to find a place to put it. And the original cafeteria was on the 2nd floor of Col-Hi. And so they had a dedicated little stairwell just for food deliveries that they didn't need anymore. And they actually ripped out part of it and put the elevator there. So Forsyth did us a favor without realizing.
So
it's
the
kind of funny.
wheelchair kids took the elevator to the
And then they could come
balcony
through here.
and then the quantum
Yeah,
tunnel.
yeah. But they couldn't get in the balcony itself because the balcony was completely non-ADA. They'd have to get on my ramp and ride the ramp.
Why is there a tunnel underneath the stage of the old auditorium?
That is the steam tunnel, and that was to get steam from the central boiler over to the Frank Phillips building, or the manual training building. Yeah. And it's still there. It's not very user-friendly. Don't worry, you haven't missed anything. It's about this high, and it's got a steam pipe. So this is the auditorium today. It's now a library. This is one of the problems I was helped solve, was that when we were adding on to the high school, we wanted a new library to be big enough for the kids. We were going to put one in the alleyway, and we found out we couldn't afford it. So then we were going to put it up against the annex and found out we still couldn't afford it. And they kept having problems, so I finally came to them and said, you know, you've got this beautiful new auditorium you built. You're not doing anything with the old auditorium. Why don't you make it a library and save a lot of money and make it useful? And they were like, what an idea. And so we actually poured concrete to level the floor out, turned the stage into where all the computers were, and then put the shelving out here with the kids. And we turned the balcony into a big conference room, so you can look out over it. It's beautiful space now. And the good news is it's not just an abandoned auditorium, which is what it was going to be, and they were just going to use it for storage, which is, you know, to me, it's like, make it functional.
Yeah.
The only sad part was that, yeah, we had to cover up the racing stripe tile at the front. That's buried underneath all that. And there are still some features. If you go into the old auditorium, you'll still see the original lights overhead. They're fun to get to, by the way. I asked the custodian, because I'm into all this nerdy stuff, I said, how do you replace those lights? They're at the top of the auditorium. Do you have to get a lift in? And he said, oh, no, I can show you. And I went, okay. And you might know, but you go up a ladder up to a catwalk, and then there's just planks. They go from light to light.
Oh.
All those stories up, and you just crawl along the plank to each bulb and replace it. And it was just like, well, this is OSHA approved. I'm There were originally 2 clocks in the auditorium. They saved one of them and got a guy who worked on clocks to repair it so it would work again, so it wasn't just right twice a day like it had been. And they did save 1 row of the original seats. And so if you go to the new library now for grades 10 to 12, you can go sit in an original seat and you can check to see that, yes, it has shrunk. But there are some original seats that we saved there. And then looking back at the signage for the building was kind of interesting, because I didn't know this until I pulled the blueprints. I always knew that it originally said senior high school and junior college on that rounded edge on the front of the building. Well, that wasn't the original plan. The original plan was to say senior high school in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. I'm like, well, that's interesting. So they probably decided to highlight the fact that they were, had junior college classes. And of course, that didn't last long because by 1950, they didn't have any junior college classes anymore. And so they actually, before I had come in '89, they chipped away the lower part of that and just kind of masked it. So it just said senior high school for many years. And I thought that looked fine to me. Well, it got on somebody's nerves because they said, well, we don't have a junior high anymore, we're middle schools. Why would you call it a senior high when there's no such thing as a junior high? Why don't you call it what it is, it's Bartlesville High School? And so they finally decided to chip it all off and put Bartlesville High School on there. And I talked to the guy who had the job of chipping those off, and he said, oh, those Dewey Portland people are just gonna kill me. He said, this stuff is so hard. He said, it's so well built. But they did change that. And on the front of the building, if you've ever noticed as you look up when you go in, it has 1939 and has BHS on both sides. It originally said BHS on one side and BJC on the other for Bartlesville Junior College. But that again is not the original plan, which I was not aware of. The original plans were for it to say BSHS, Bartlesville Senior High School. But someone probably said that looked weird and just said BHS. Which actually worked in their favor because when they became Bartlesville High School, then it just fit perfectly, BHS. Although everybody called it Col-Hi. And then, of course, they didn't actually put the college high school signage on it until Sooner was around. And then they needed to distinguish it, so they added college high school to the side of the auditorium and then took that off when they combined the schools differently in '82. Okay. This is something you may or may not have known. There used to be an amphitheater out in the floodplain behind the school. And this was not built by the PWA, but by the WPA. Because you remember it was an alphabet soup back in the Great Depression of agencies. And so the Works Progress Administration actually built a sandstone amphitheater out here behind the manual training building. And it flooded all the time. And so there was a little creek that ran through here. And so debris would get on it and they'd have to clean it. And it was driving them crazy and nobody wanted to use it because it was dirty. And so they finally made a deal with Phillips. And so when the Adams building was being built, they had to excavate for the immense basement for it. And so they made a deal with Phillips to just have that dirt hauled. You couldn't do this anymore. Hauled to Col-Hi and just dumped over that entire area to build it up. And so if you know it, when it was a practice field over there and stuff like that, that was all the fill from the Adams building that was brought in. And I've been doing different research and looking at the school archives while I still can before I retire. And so I found the note where the superintendent actually asked Endicott, remember Endicott of Phillips? Asked him if they wouldn't waive the charges for hauling the dirt. And Endicott said, we'll give you the dirt, but you're going to have to pay to haul it. And I just thought that was funny. So there is a bit of the Adams buildings underneath over there now. And that's why, if you look at this picture, I can tell you it's from after 1948, because you can actually tell that's where they dumped all that dirt. All that is fill, to fill in that old amphitheater, that low spot, which later would become practice field and stuff like that. And now, I'm not sure what's on there. Part of the Freshman Academy, maybe part of the Commons, different things are there. Let's go back to 1939 when it opened, because I found this article in the Examiner. And so this will do some comparisons. Here's what the foyer looked like up until 2007, and it looked pretty much like it did in 1939. If you walked in, you still had that wall here with into the auditorium with these porthole windows and the doors. You still had the same floor. You still had a little different ceiling, but other than that, it really hadn't changed much. Now, of course, it looks very different, and one change that did happen was the Wildcat and the Bruin disappeared. And so the Wildcat was not original. It was added when Senior High came along. So they built Senior High, and they put in the terrazzo there that's still there, the Spartan. And so the Wildcats needed something. And they said, we need something on the floor too. So they added the Wildcat. And then when they combined the schools and rejiggered everything around in '82, they put a Bruin at Col-Hi and an identical Bruin over at Sooner. And so you can still see that Bruin. It still exists, its friend does, over at what is now Madison Middle School. But the Wildcat is gone. And so I was sad that they took that out. I couldn't convince them not to. But I did get pictures of it that were non-distorted and stuff, so I could preserve it virtually. But they redid all that, and the reason they did was because they wanted to get rid of all this flooring, because all this flooring is asphaltum, which also had a mixture of asbestos fibers in it. And so they decided it was time to just rip all that out and tint the building, get rid of all the asbestos and not have that anymore. And so when they redid it, there's that's what it looks like in near perfect digital form with the Wildcat and the Bruin. And in 2012, they took it out, and they changed the foyer quite a bit. They took out a whole series of rooms off the office and put in a window wall so they could see and supervise more of what's going on in the foyer, which was a good idea. And then that wall that you saw before is completely different looking now, because when we redid this into a library, we had to make this the entrance. We preserved some porthole windows in the new doors, but this side is now a ramp providing handicapped access. And so it's an echo of my quantum tunnel, but it's now going to those floors so that you can have handicapped access all over the building. So it looked quite different. That's the foyer today. So if you walked in now. And so there is a Bruin, but it's a new Bruin, and it's kind of in this vinyl tile. So it looks attractive, but it's different. You can just kind of see the echoes of the original foyer still in the buff terracotta tile work, of course, that's on the walls. And did you know there were fireplaces in Col-Hi?
No.
There were two. One was in what is now the principal's office, but at that time was a lounge for college students, because it was junior college, so they had a reception room lounge and had a little fireplace in there. And then the other fireplace was back in the home economics area. Yes?
That's class of 58,
Yeah.
James Emerson and Richard Cloud.
See, there you go. You recognize it. And they're posing by one of the original fireplaces. And so both those fireplaces are gone, but when we were renovating and the principal talked to me once, I said, did you know there was a fireplace in here? And they're like, what? Why would there be a fireplace? And I said, well, because this wasn't a principal's office. The principal's office was actually a little tiny room off to the side that had all this intercom equipment behind it, and it was pretty shoved in there. And the intercom equipment was still there until a few years ago. It didn't work, but it was kind of historic looking to me. And the home ec department was actually where now is counseling and those kind of services, and like a mail room and a coffee room. But all that was home ec. It used to be on the first floor, and they had a cooking lab and a clothing lab and a bedroom and a living room with another fireplace. And all that shifted because when they built the annex, they moved home ec down to the basement of the annex, which is where I knew it to be, when they had a big sewing room and the cooking lab and a little living room. My wife actually taught in that living room for a while, but not as a social home economics teacher. And this is a picture. Yeah,
They still do home ec.
they do not,
Yeah.
and that's why we cannot find any certified teachers in the subject. No one will certify it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so you can't find anyone who meets the highly qualified teacher credentials to do it. And so a lot of people say, well, I wish you'd offer it. It's like, well, we wish we could too, but there's nobody taking that major. They won't major in it. And so we had a few that we were just limping along with, just and we emergency certified somebody, and stuff like that, and then we said, okay, we just can't do it. And so now that area that you might think of as home ec, if you were a little bit younger than the people that went to Col-Hi in the old days, so if you think of it as in the annex, that's now a couple of discipline rooms and adult education rooms and the kitchen and all. But it was still home ec when I was there.
What's a discipline room?
That's where you go when you've been very bad. Yes, and you have to sit and do your homework without getting to interact with your buddies. So, so it's pass, things like that.
No chains.
Huh?
No chains.
No, it's always the same. It's called the teenager room. And if you know of the original building, it had a choir room on that curving part that had the sign on the outside on the first floor. And that's still there, and it can't change. People have often asked me if we could change it because they'd like to turn it into other purposes. And I said, great, get yourself a jackhammer, because that entire thing is solid concrete built up underneath on piers. So you'd have to jackhammer that whole thing out to make it into a regular classroom. And so we went, okay. And so actually now there are flight simulators in there for the aviation class, and they built themselves an obstacle course because they could give them a rough terrain and obstacles to fly their drones through to practice their aeronautics, which I thought was a pretty cute solution. Like, okay. And that top picture is when Susan Mueller was doing choir in there, when it was just packed with kids. I mean, it was just, my Lord, how many more can you squeeze in?
Carla could be in there.
Yeah, and now they have the Susan Mueller choir room down in the Fine Arts Center that's very nice and much roomier. Here's another view of an older part of the building. Let me see if I can get in the right spot. Yep. This is the original library, which is probably where some of you knew it to be. I knew it as part of the library, because when I came to the high school, the library was split across the hall. So you had the reading room, which was the part that obviously was the library, and then across the hall you had, they called it the reference room. Do you know what I'm talking about, some of you? And that was really the original cafeteria, was the reference room. Because it used to be library on one side, on the Hillcrest side, and then across the hall was the cafeteria upstairs, which is not very friendly for hauling stuff around. And the library looks very different now. It still has those glass blocks and stuff, but all the shelving's out, and it's now like a conference room on one part, and the other part is just a classroom. And of course, it was way too small even when I came for the level of number of kids they had, but that's why they had taken over the old cafeteria and made it part of the library, because the cafeteria was on the second floor originally and had a serving line and this area, and it later also became a study hall for many years, they said. And so that's where it used to be. But probably none of you remember it there, because it was moved later to the basement, which is probably where most of you think of the cafeteria as the basement. And that was in 1956, I think. So there's another view of the cafeteria slash study hall. If we're wondering what it is today, it's a room that has been used most recently as a computer lab, part of it, and another big chunk of it, the part that's all kind of the kitchen parts, are part of our severe and profound special education programs in there, because they can have their washing machine and different things that they can learn skills with. They're there, so adaptive reuse. And there's a shot of the beautiful 1958 cafeteria, which some of you might remember, which is in the basement, 1956. And that was an unfinished basement. When they built it, they knew that they might finish it eventually. And in fact, in the original plans, they called for part of it to be a rifle range and part of it for bicycle parking. And they actually did act upon that in the war. They had it completely unfinished when they first opened, but during the war I found the minutes where they went in and said, you know, that could be built as a rifle range for our ROTC kids. And so they actually did finish that out and did use it briefly as a rifle range, which of course in today's environment is like, you can't even bring a gun on campus, let alone have a rifle range. But that's what that originally was, and then it was remodeled, all of that area, into the cafeteria that some of you might recall. And by the way they made that work, since there was no air conditioning, was they built a false wall all the way around it and then put all the vents and stuff behind that. So if you actually go in there and know which door to take, you can actually step onto dirt, because they never finished that part, and walk completely around the cafeteria outside it, which is kind of a strange feeling. And people don't even know you're there. You can holler at them through the wall and think you're a ghost. That cafeteria now has been remodeled into the Phillips Innovation Labs. And so that's where all the STEM classes at the high school have their pre-engineering work and do their robotics work. And that's a tour with Greg Garland. Some of you might know Greg. He's a former Phillips head. And that's Joy Hoffmeister when she was the state superintendent. And we toured that with them to show them what we've done with that adaptive reuse of that into STEM. And that's still being taught by one of my students, David Ayers. And then this is an auxiliary cafeteria that was added. When I came, it was like a nurse's office and special ed room sometimes. And that was just built because they were so packed at the end of the baby boom that they were desperate for space, so they added that auxiliary cafeteria. It has been removed, and now it's just cooling towers there. I actually lobbied to have that as a physics lab at one point, because I was so desperate for room in the little annex, and I was like, give me that old cafeteria thing. And they're like, no, can't have that. And this is what the old science labs look like in 39. This is the lecture hall. It still exists, although it doesn't look like that. And that was right above the choir room. So there's the choir room that was a curve, and then above that was seating for a lecture hall, and they actually had the two science labs on each end. One was physics, one was chemistry. And then you come in here for your lecture, a very old-fashioned way of teaching science, but it's what they wanted. And this is George Karch. He was one of my predecessors. He was a physics teacher, and he was in charge of the Real Club. And this is him training his students to run the film projectors and learn about film in that room. I used to know it as the faculty meeting room, because we would go up there and have faculty meetings. And I could tell you stories. But anyway, that was remodeled, I think about 1990s, late 90s or early 2000s by Phillips. And they remodeled it into a remote learning room. And so I was able to take some graduate courses from OSU in that room at some desks they built.
When you went into that faculty room,
Yeah.
was it full of cigarette smoke?
It could have been. It stank a little. Was that a smoking haven?
Well, I taught school for a few years.
Yeah.
And every teacher's lounge was, and you couldn't go in there unless you were a smoker.
Yeah. When I came to the high school, we still had smoking, and so there was a smoker's lounge, but it was the downstairs in the receiving room area. There was the designated smoker's lounge, and then there was the non-smoking lounge above that. And of course, I always tell kids that when I was in high school, you could smoke, and they actually had a smoking area for students. They just looked at me like,
I remember those.
what in the world? Yeah.
Do you remember when they had portable buildings?
Oh, yeah.
For extra room?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I don't know how long that lasted.
It lasted a few years at Col-Hi. You'll see a picture here of it during the baby boom until they built
I
Center,
remember that.
and they could get rid of them. Now, they were growing after they built it, so they did add the annex. This is that 3-story addition that kind of got crammed up against the auditorium. And on top of it was a beautiful, I'm kidding, greenhouse. This was right above my physics lab, and it leaked very profusely into my room because they hadn't used it in years and it was rusted out. They finally tore that off the annex and sealed it up. And now, of course, we have gorgeous brand new greenhouses down by the Ag Center. So we have the largest greenhouses of any high school in Oklahoma now. And so when they have a tour in a few weeks, I think it'll be in sometime September, of the open house at the Ag Center, if you're interested in greenhouses, come take a look at them because they're really nice. And they're not on top of the roof, which is great. Because, it never made much sense to me, but that's what they did. They did get sun up there, but they also had water tends to follow gravity. And let's see if we can go on. Yep. This is one of when we started adding on. The science rooms were really inadequate. They were way too small for what we were supposed to be doing with all the hands-on work we did. And so we convinced the community to support us in the big 2001 bond issue to make many changes to the high school. And one of the first ones that was meaningful to me was adding on the science wing. And so that's the original part of the science wing that was built with 6 rooms. They were much more spacious and better equipped than what we had in the old annex and some old converted English rooms and things. So that was great. We added more later. Here's what the old rooms looked like for their original finishes. They had this really pretty tile, but of course it had asbestos in it, so eventually it was replaced. And slate chalkboards and birch wood. The birch wood is all still there, all still working. It's beautiful. The slate boards are pretty much replaced now with whiteboards because nobody wants to use chalkboards. But if you know what I'm talking about, writing on a slate board is such bliss compared to a modern chalkboard. They're just so much nicer. But nobody wants to use chalk anymore. And there's the old hallway. If you can imagine what it used to look like. There's very few shots where you can see what the ceilings used to look like in Col-Hi before they put in air conditioning and lowered it and put in fluorescent lights. But you can see it had very high ceilings because there's no air conditioning, so you had to let the warm air rise and just incandescent bulbs down it. And when I came, it was City Service Empire Green paint all through the building with dark brown lockers. Does anyone remember that look? And the reason it was City Service Empire Green paint was because City Service left town in the 1968. And they left a lot of, my dad worked for City Service, so I recognized the paint. It's the same paint we used on our vacation cabin in Missouri. I was like, oh, it's that same color. Because of course they had immense quantities of Empire Green paint that the school district got for free. And they used it for decades. Because when I went on, I was like, oh, I know where you got that paint from.
Is it Kelly green or light?
No, it's a lighter green. It was called Empire Green. It was specially formulated for City Service. And my dad did his best to match it when they stopped making it anymore. Because it's like, thanks, Dad. It kind of looks like mint ice cream. It's not unattractive, but it's different. This is the Frank Phillips building, or the manual training building. And so you might not have ever seen it when it was used for assemblies, but that's when it was still using it as a stage. And here's the graduates, and here's graduation happening in there. And of course, when I was there, they turned the stage into a concession stand, which it still is today. And this is the Phillips 66ers, because the real reason that Frank could justify spending this kind of money is that he had his Phillips 66ers, which he was very proud of, and wanted a place for them to play that was good. And so they played there and used that as their home court until the Adams building was built with its much nicer, bigger, even bigger gym. And that became the new home court for the 66ers. So that's Bob Curlin's in that shot, if you know anything about the 66ers. And here's kind of the floor plan for the manual training building. And this is what it kind of looks like today when we have a throwback game. They'll have a throwback basketball game, and all the kids go into the old field house and see what it used to be like instead of being in the new one. And so that's where it is, and this is now the stage that's now, originally it was also the band room, by the way, because they had no band room, so that was the band room with little practice rooms behind it. And then around it was manual training. So there was drafting and a little lecture area, metal shop, and wood shop. Now when I came there, this was journalism, because metal shop was gone, and wood shop had turned into a wrestling room. And you could always tell the wrestling room was there, because as soon as you opened the doors to the field house, you went,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, wrestling's in here. It doesn't smell quite that much now. And that, by the way, that old metal shop is now an auxiliary music room. And it's actually attached by a stair into the band room, into the Fine Arts Center. So it's kind of interesting how we bled into the older buildings. And if you go underneath, one oddity about us is that we looked for a place for the percussion. They wanted a place for their percussion cave, they called it, where they could do all their percussion. And we're like, we're not going to build another building just for that. So they finally figured out that, well, there is this area down below, which was manual training for a while, where they did athletic training and stuff. And they actually built a ramp in there, and that's now the percussion cave. And so, to me, it's the best tornado shelter you can have. You can get down there and bang for help when you get trapped. And just to go through some of the changes on campus, 1952 is when they added the field. They didn't have a football field at first. They played at Municipal Stadium, which is now Dungeons Memorial Stadium. That's where the football games were taken. And in 1954, they built the stadium, which, by the way, did not come in on budget. And 1958, they built that annex with the extra classrooms. 1963, they added that metal building for the auxiliary cafeteria. 1968, they had to have air conditioning. Why? Sooner had it. That's right. Sooner High was a brand new building that was built with air conditioning. College-High did not have air conditioning. And because of that, Sooner was not allowed to turn on its air conditioning until College-High's air conditioning was ready, and then they turned it on. As they just had too many upset people about, my poor child, you know.
Yeah, really.
So it's kind of funny. But it's like, well, at least they finally got air conditioning.
And now then they start school in August instead of September.
Yeah, right. And without air conditioning, you know, you wouldn't dream of doing that. You'd wait till after Labor Day. And they did add the auxiliary gym on at that time, and that's where the portables had been during the height of the baby boom, was where they built the auxiliary gym. And so here's what it looked like before there was a football field. So that's the band out on just grass, which is where the football field would appear. And then this is when the stadium was being constructed still for Cecil Lefty Custer, who had started out at Central. And he had just recently passed, and so that's why they named it after Cecil. And he actually coached the Wildcats and also their predecessors. So that's another trivia question. What was Bartlesville's team before the Wildcats?
Wildcatters.
Oh, I used to know that.
The Yellow Jackets. So he was the Yellow Jackets coach. And then, of course, we also had the Douglas Dragons at a separate school.
Yeah.
But he was a Yellow Jacket coach and then became a Wildcat coach. And of course, Wildcat was great because it's Wildcatters. You think of Wildcats, they use black and gold as their colors. You know, it's very clever, I thought.
And Custer also ran Santa Cruz.
Yes, yes, yeah. Custer ran the Sandy Pool, which is over on Seneca for many years, which is the big school.
Ran the what?
Sandy Pool.
Big municipal pool,
Yeah.
From miles away.
oval shape.
When they built the stadium, they actually put in this interesting tile pattern, which I thought was rather odd. So when they were renovating it, I asked the architect, what is that? And they called that running bird. But that's called the running bird tile pattern. It's not there anymore because those tiles were all flaking off and falling off, and so they had to redo it. But that's what that used to have. And now the classrooms that are in the middle level of the stadium are now all Bruin Academy. So that's where all the alternative classes are for kids that need to catch up on credits because of different life circumstances. And then in the basement is, of course, where the locker rooms were. And that is a shot right after the 1986 flood, that was the only part of the building that flooded. And the reason it flooded was because it came up through the drains of the building there. So it didn't hit the main building, but it did flood the bottom level of the stadium up to about 3 or 4 feet. You can actually see the stain line. And of course, I talked to Judy Hodges, who used to teach business there, and she had her typing lab in the basement, and she said, yeah, it was fun. They called it Lake Hodges. She didn't think it was funny at all. And they actually had people just rushing to get all the typewriters up and out of the stadium before it flooded. The Pressbox was where that budget problem that I mentioned with the stadium came in. When they finished the stadium, they didn't have enough money for the Pressbox. Architects apologized because they had not estimated properly. So the architects actually paid for that Pressbox, which was meant to be a temporary Pressbox and was in use from 1955 until 2020. And so you ever wonder why they had such a crummy Pressbox? Because I always wondered that, because I was like, wow, this is not very good. That was just an architect's freebie to make up for the fact that they didn't get to build the Pressbox they wanted to have. And then in 2020, they actually built a brand new Pressbox, which is very nice. And a third of that did come from private money. It wasn't all public money. And that was much needed if you've ever been in the old Pressbox. It was like, wow.
Do they have a way to get up to it?
Up to the Pressbox?
I mean, like, without going up all the steps?
Oh, yeah. There's an elevator.
I was gonna say.
There's got to be handicap
access.
access to everything now. So yeah,
Okay.
there's an elevator back there. Yeah, that'll take you right up to the Pressbox level. And also, I insisted that it also stop at the level for the concession stands.
Yeah.
So they didn't have to keep using the old dumb waiters. I said, give them an elevator while you're here. And they're like, oh, yeah, we can do that. This is the height of the baby boom, 64, 65. And that's when they were running 3 different schedules, starting at 3 different times a day. And they had portable buildings all through here. And that still wasn't enough. I mean, it was just packed. But of course, they barely convinced the town to build sooner. And of course, they miscalculated because the instant Sooner opened, the baby bus started hitting, and the numbers are just plummeting. And so it was a kind of a fiasco. And so it's one of those things of we all live with the consequences of it. But it's kind of interesting. If they just waited, they would have made it through that squeeze phase and might be then okay. But as it is, we got a building that Madison still loves to use. And this is some more of those additions. This is that addition for the gym that was added. This is the air conditioning. They actually had to build a building onto the back for air conditioning, and they got a freebie out of it. The counseling offices are on top of that. That was built at the same time. These 4 little offices back there. And that's what the auxiliary gym looks like if you've never been in it. And the baby bus happened. Yeah.
I lived in that gym.
Oh, yeah. There you go. You know it.
And when we came over, when they put the schools together,
Yeah.
there was no dressing room
Oh,
for
no.
the girls. You had to
Yeah.
use the general one. There was I can't see it in that picture, it's probably more on this side. There was
Yeah.
an old closet that just had junk in it.
Right.
We took it all out,
Hey, that's your
painted
dressing
it,
room.
got old lockers from the Y,
Yep.
and no bathroom or anything in there, but we had our own little space.
Yeah, and since then, they've redone all that old locker room stuff and made it much better than it was, because yeah, it was very restrictive.
Well, the locker rooms in the mid gym
Yeah,
are unbelievable.
yeah, they're really nice. And so they had this baby bus that happened, and when the baby, I know it's 1 o'clock, so if you need to go, you can go. But the baby bus happened, and what happened was enrollments just plummeted, and that meant improvements of the facility just didn't happen. There were just years where they were static because the district was just losing enrollment, fighting money troubles from that, as you can imagine, because the enrollment's tied to your funding. And so there were no changes for many years, and in fact, when they finally reconfigured to make Sooner into mid-high, that was done without a bond issue. They actually had failed a bond issue to do a reconfiguration, and then the superintendent basically fell on his sword. He's still alive, by the way, the guy that pulled it off, Sooner, remember it? Superintendent Neischwander. Yeah, and he kind of fell on his sword. He knew he was going to lose his job to do it, but he said, you've got to do it. He said, you know, it makes no sense. We can't afford 2 schools like this anymore. And so he did lose his job eventually over that, probably.
That's because he wouldn't leave it the Wildcats.
That's right. They renamed it.
Yeah.
And so the 90s were full of trouble. That's when I came to Bartlesville. And so it was just, we had, you know, shortfalls. We had failed bond issues. We failed a village vote. We were going to be annexed to Dewey. We didn't pass the millage, and so we had to have a revote on the millage so we wouldn't get annexed to Dewey. So it was a very troubled period. And so I began to question, you know, my future in Bartlesville, frankly, because the 90s were so awful in the school system. And then finally, everything turned around because we had the big bond issue in 2001, and it passed. And that's when we made huge changes. We added the parking lots all around the building to modernize that. We added practice fields in the back rather than using that one little part. We had the Haley Environmental Laboratory, which is still there. We added a science wing, which I've shown you. We added the beautiful Fine Arts Center, which looks like that. If you've never been in there, you've got to go and see it. People are still impressed, even though it's 13, 14 years old. The new Bruin Field House was added, which is gorgeous. That's not the same lights that are in it now. They've been redone. And they added the library, which I showed you was a remodel of the old auditorium. And then the next big change was when, a few years ago, when we decided to reconfigure and basically get rid of Madison as an expensive site to maintain, move Madison to the mid-high, and move the mid-high kids back to the high school campus. And that meant adding on a lot. And so they added on the freshman academy, a new cafeteria and commons, and new classrooms for sophomores, essentially, and another science wing. And so those are lots of changes there, and it's a really beautiful building now. When I take alumni groups through, they're just kind of shocked. They're just like, is this even the same building? But what's fun about taking the alumni groups through is they look at all this, there's marveling how beautiful it all is, and then you always take them at the end to the old gym. Because they can smell and feel it, and they're just taken back. You can just see them being transported because they're back in that old gym where they used to cheer for the team or play. And so that's fun. It's really fun to do. But that's just some shots of what it looks like. That's the front of the Freshman Academy and its library, which is a pretty interesting look. This is the Commons, which is gorgeous. You've never been there. It's a wonderful place to eat now. It's not down in the basement. We kind of probably overcompensated by saying, let's have an entire wall of windows so that we're no longer in the basement. And the campus has grown. I mean, the red part is what it originally was, and the yellow is all the stuff we've added over the years. And so they added a lot of acreage here in the 73 for the Haley Lab that was an environmental laboratory area. They bought out the old Phillips 66 gas station here in its own parking lot. They bought out the Village Parking Center. They used to have apartments here. Some of you might remember the old apartments. I knew a teacher that lived there. And that's now where the indoor practice facility and the original ag building that we're still using, where they have shops and classrooms. And then over here, they've got parking now and practice fields, and then this is the new ag center that you can go see next month. And their big greenhouses off to the side. So it's grown enormously. And there's just a shot, in case you've never been in these places, that's what the inside of the indoor practice facility looks like. It's really nice, get out of the weather. That's the back side of the indoor practice facility where they have a weight room and a cheerleading area. And this is the ag center, the part that was not brand new, the part that was built a few years ago. That's where they have that shop and they have classrooms. And then this is the new ag center that I'm hoping that you'll come out and see. And this is the inside of the arena in the new ag center where they can show their animals. So it's been a huge story at BHS of change and adaptation and reuse. The good news, though, is they're using just about every space they've got. There's not really a wasted effort. And it's a reflection of investing back in yourself. And the town has finally been able to do that with maintaining a facility and making it bigger, doing the same thing with Central. And so I'd be happy to take any questions, but that is the conclusion of my talk to you. Thank you all.
Can you tell us anything about the Col-Hi mascot, Willie the Wildcat?
Yeah, Willie the Wildcat. You see lots of, I only get to see yearbook photos, but there was like a paper mache Wildcat thing that they used for many years, right?
Yes.
And then I know people would don with a Wildcat outfit. And then, of course, the Willie appeared on some paraphernalia I've seen. Can you tell us some more?
Yes, that paper mache head
Yeah, the head.
for the costume.
Yeah.
Last time I saw it was in a display case, in a trophy case
Yep.
on the second floor at the far end of the gym.
Yes. And
And
that's
it is labeled as having been donated by the first male cat. And that is wrong. I think the first live Willie the Wildcat was Richard Keeler in about 1957 or 8.
So it probably was donated by the second male?
It was about the fourth.
Oh, the fourth male.
Yeah, I've been trying to track that down.
Yeah.
But that label in the display case.
Yeah.
Unless I told Principal Harp about this.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's been changed or not, but that is you know.
It's not quite right.
Misdisplayed for a museum piece.
It was donated by a male wildcat.
By the
Not first.
by the first male after several females, after some earlier males.
All right, very good.
That's true.
Yeah,
Charlie Hull was between.
they got very close. They didn't impact anything on campus. We didn't have any damage that I'm aware of at all. And we were incredibly lucky, because if you walk down the Pathfinder, you can see that we just dodged a bullet. I mean, it came within about 1,000 feet at its edge of where you start seeing tree damage. So, and of course, it really came close. That's 1,000 feet from the Ag Center, the brand new Ag Center. The superintendent was contacting me at that time, just like, oh my God. But yeah, it didn't hit the Ag Center.
Is there any remembrance of the Wildcat?
Oh,
anywhere?
yeah. If you go in the field house, there's a display case that's full of, there's a whole section on Spartans, there's a whole section on Wildcats. I think there's a section on the Dragons, which is the Douglas Dragons, which is the separate school. And then there's the Wildcat tree. If you remember, there's a giant elm that used to grow at the north end of the building. And that was covered in mistletoe, which meant it was going to die, if you know mistletoe. Mistletoe is a parasite. And so we built the science wing. We were very careful not to damage that tree and not damage its roots. But I said it's still going to die. I knew it was. And it lived for a few more years, and then it finally died. And so they paid Cass, I don't remember his full name, Cass, the chainsaw guy, and he sculpted it. And he sculpted one part into a Bruin and the other part into a Wildcat. And a class of the Wildcats and several classes of the Bruins paid for that. And then over the years, it was out in the weather, it started to rot, as it will, because you have to treat it. And so they finally decided to cut it off, re-sculpt it again, so there's a smaller Wildcat, because the barn pit had rotted. We didn't want that. And if you go if you first go in toward the field house, if you will look to your right, you will see what's left of that tree. And it has a Wildcat and a Bruin. And that's that was established by those classes. Yeah.
Cool. Do you have the date for the Ag Center tour?
I don't have the date, because they haven't told me yet, but I know it's in September. So it's coming, and I'll make sure I get it out on Facebook. You bet. Yeah.
When they had the open house for the science wing, I snuck into the old fort part.
Yeah.
The old lockers were still there.
Uh-huh.
Are they still there?
The original lockers to the old part of the building, all those lockers have been changed out. They were changed out some years ago. Now, one thing they preserved that I told them was, I said, one of the best things about these lockers is the trash bins. Because they had built-in trash bins in the lockers. And I said, that's such a wonderful idea. I said, don't lose that. And so when they put in the new lockers, they're segmented now, they're wider, because they were too narrow for what kids were doing these days. But they're half heights, and they have little trash bins, because I said, you gotta keep that idea. It's such a fun idea.
Do you still have the, in the library, the memory, you know, where you can go in and look at the yearbooks?
Yes, there's still the alumni room, and it's in one of those old green rooms. So
Okay.
it's one of those, curving rooms off the
Because I
auditorium.
tried to call, you know, you
Yeah.
can't get through anybody. And
Yeah,
I said,
it's still there.
Okay.
And it's filled with yearbooks
Is
and
it
stuff
still
like
open for
that.
the public?
Oh yeah, you just gotta ask Kim to get you in there. Kim Lashbrook's the librarian. Just go by and she'll say, oh, okay, sure. She'll let you.
Okay.
Yeah, but all the stuff's in there. Yeah.
The difference between modern and Art Deco.
Yes.
Now, I've wrongly referred to this all the time as Art Deco.
Yeah.
So is it similar?
Yeah, Streamline Moderne was just the last phase of Art Deco is what we would call it, but really it's probably a time thing. Because it doesn't really look that much like some of Art Deco, but it does others. But it was the last phase of Art Deco, and it's where they were influenced more by locomotion, but not really jets yet. They didn't really have the jet influence or any of that. So that's why you see, and they had a porthole, like ocean liner look. And so that's the last phase. And so you can call it Art Deco, which it is, but it's the Streamline Moderne phase of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you remember the old Central School?
Oh, yeah.
Does anybody remember Abraham Lincoln sitting up in the window there?
I don't know that story, but I see some nods here.
But it's gone now, but Abraham Lincoln was sitting right there
When you looked out the
Stood there
window.
proudly looking out that
Yeah.
window, yeah.
Well, Central is still filled with those busts, of all the different presidents from up to when it was built, I suppose. And they've now taken to decorating them. And so I've gone in and seen different neckties on the different presidents, and I think, oh, that's cute. You know, it's respectful. You know, but it's like, oh, let's change his tie. You know, but it's like, I'm not sure George Washington wore that kind of tie. It looks nice. Well, thank you all.
You know when Sadie Hawkins Day stopped?
Oh, it stopped some years ago. Yeah, it was one of those things of, it became out of sync with the times, and they started moving, but they still had a day where the girls invite the boys. They just don't call it the same thing. So yeah, they still have the tradition of the girls' turn, but she just don't call it Sadie Hawkins. They probably don't remember who Sadie Hawkins was originally. They're like, who's Sadie Hawkins? Because they don't remember that comic strip.
I heard the rumor that some kid got stripped and left in the river bottoms and died.
Oh, I hope not.
That's when they stopped Sadie
There's
Hawkins.
also a story about 2 footprints you can see in the Madison hallway that are some kid who died in some mysterious way. I'm like, it's a stain. We haven't replaced that tile yet. Well, thank you all, and I'll be happy to stay if you have any more questions. But thank you.
Thank you, Granger, very much. We have a display back here in our hallway. If anyone is interested in the old Wildcat and the Spartan head that used to be his Sooner. Am I saying that right? Sooner was the Spartans.
Yes.
Yeah.
Col-Hi was the Wildcats. And from what I've been told, that is the original stuffed Wildcat that was the mascot at Col-Hi. So don't quote me on that, but that's what I have been told. So,
But is it male or female? That's what I want to know. I'm not going to look
check
at it.
if you want.
No, I'm not going to.
But you feel free to go down there if you'd like. It's at the end of this hallway here.
Yeah.
Thank you all for
Thank
coming
you all.
today.
Here, thank you.